If you'd like to go ahead and open your Bible up to Matthew, the 12th chapter. That's where our first reading will be in just a moment. As you turn there, let me just take a moment to say how much I appreciate your presence. It's an encouragement to me. We have a number who are traveling. It's that time of year. We've got a number who are out sick, and we certainly miss them. But I appreciate your presence. I appreciate those that are visiting with us. Welcome you and hope that you can come back and be with us every opportunity you have. We're going to be talking this morning about words, how that words matter. Words really have great power. It has been said of Winston Churchill that he went to war with the English language, that in a time when basically England was standing alone in the world, when, before the United States had joined the fight and some other countries and France was falling, that he, with his words, was able to rally the English people, to keep them going during a very difficult time with his words, with his radio addresses. We also know that words sometimes, they can cut you till you bleed. They can leave scars upon us. In Matthew, the 12th chapter, Jesus sounds a strong warning about our words. When he says in verse 34, "Brood of vipers, how can you being evil speak good things? For out of the abundance of the heart the mouth speaks. A good man out of the good treasure of his heart brings forth good things. And an evil man out of the evil treasure brings forth evil things. But I say to you that for every idle word men may speak, they will give account of it in the day of judgment. For by your words you will be justified, and by your words you will be condemned." When we think about the standard of God's judgment, there are various passages that might come to mind. You might think of Matthew 25 and that great scene where he talks about their care for one another or their lack of care for one another. You might think of a 1 Corinthians 6, 9 and 10, where he lists off different sins that could keep one from heaven. But here, he focuses on our words. By your words you will be justified. By your words you will be condemned. Recently I had one of those Bible reading days where, as I'm going through some different chapters, it just seemed to be a theme that, and I don't mean it in any kind of miraculous way, but it seemed providential that God was trying to get my attention about language, words. What do I say? And what I want to do is very simple this morning. I'm going to look at 3 of the chapters I read that day, not in all detail, but some of the things that stood out in it to me about my words. Acts 27 is where I'm turning first. And the setting, of course, is Paul as he's traveling to Rome. He's on a ship, and they've left a little bit late in the year, later than they should have, and they get to the island of Crete, and he says, they first pull into the port of Fair Havens. He said, "We need to stay here. Don't go any further." But it says that the captain and the owner of the ship, they decided, no, we need to at least get around to another port on the island of Crete. Well, a storm comes up, and they're tossed about for 2 weeks and end up shipwrecked. And there is, in this chapter, I saw a couple of things about words. One I consider a secondary point, and the other a major point. But I want to give you the secondary point first. I want you to look at something in verse 11 when Paul has told them, don't leave this port. It says, "Nevertheless, the centurion," now that's the soldier in charge of Paul, "he was more persuaded by the helmsman and the owner of the ship than by the things spoken by Paul." What this man does is he basically says, well, these guys know a whole lot more about sailing than Paul does. I'm going to listen to the experts. Now, I would think a man who's been shipwrecked 3 times already knows a bit about the dangers of the ocean, or the Mediterranean Sea in this case. But he listened to the experts. I understand this is a point that can be misunderstood, it can be misapplied, and it doesn't always apply. But sometimes I believe there are occasions when we dismiss people because, well, what do they know? You know, they're not as educated as somebody else. They're not as, smart as somebody else. And so we tend to dismiss. And there are some folks that may not possess advanced degrees, who may not, they may not be the expert in the field, but they have some wisdom we ought to listen to. And I just want to caution us on that. But the main point of this chapter that caught my attention is near the end of the chapter, starting in verse 33. The next day they're going to be shipwrecked. Well, that day almost, it was about to dawn. And Paul implored them, verse 33, to take food, saying, "Today is the 14th day you have waited and continue without food and eaten nothing. Therefore I urge you to take nourishment, for this is for your survival, since not a hair will fall from the head of any of you." And when he had said these things, he took bread and gave thanks to God in the presence of them all. And when he had broken it, he began to eat. Then they were all encouraged and also took food themselves. You could notice about the words of Paul that he expresses concern for the well-being of others. That he expresses a great concern. I want you to eat because you need this strength. But I'm especially focusing in on, he took the bread and gave thanks to God in the presence of them all. Now somebody immediately thinks, wait a minute. What about Matthew the 6th chapter? Matthew 6 in verse 5, Jesus said, "And when you pray, you shall not be like the hypocrites. For they love to pray standing in the synagogues and on the corners of the streets, that they may be seen by men. Assuredly, I say to you, they have their reward. But you, when you pray, go into your room, and when you have shut your door, pray to your Father who is in the secret place, and your Father who sees in secret will reward you openly." Could Paul have taken, as he said, everybody needs to eat? Could Paul have taken the food he was going to eat and in his mind silently expressed a prayer of thanksgiving for the food? Well, certainly he could have done that. Why didn't he do that? Why didn't Paul, somebody say, do what Jesus said? Well, I don't believe in any way Paul violated what Jesus was saying. Motive really matters. Jesus was addressing a people who like to be praised of men, who like to do things so that they drew attention to themselves. God calls on us to let our light shine. Is it possible that sometimes, whether it be actual prayers or just anything relating to speaking up on behalf of God and things of God, I use Matthew 6 as my excuse when the real reason is I'm embarrassed. I don't want to be seen. It's not about, I don't want to be seen of men to be praised. I don't want to be seen of men lest I be judged, lest I be criticized. No, God doesn't want us to be these people. And in that 6th chapter, he talks about sounding the trumpet when they gave alms. He doesn't want us to be people who are trying to bring glory to ourselves. But how many times are we told, don't hide your light? Let your light shine before men, that they may see your good works and glorify your Father in heaven. Matthew 5:16. You remember the story in Acts, the 16th chapter, when Paul and Silas have been beaten and imprisoned. And it says in verse 25, at midnight, Paul and Silas were praying and singing hymns to God, and the prisoners were listening to them. They sang and were heard. God does not want us to be ashamed. Luke 9 in verse 26, Jesus cautions us that we are not to ever be ashamed of Him. Verse 26, whoever is ashamed of me and my words, of him the Son of Man will be ashamed when He comes in His own glory and in His Father's and of the holy angels. And this is one of those, there's not a one of us here probably would say, oh, I'm ashamed of Jesus. And in one sense, I don't think we ever would be. But are we ever reluctant to let our faith be seen? To let people know that we're in an environment where faith is not admired and appreciated. And so it's best to just kind of keep quiet. In Matthew the 10th chapter, and I said a few weeks ago in reading this, there's a blend of the positive and the negative. But he says, beginning at verse 28, do not fear those who kill the body, but cannot kill the soul. But rather fear him who is able to destroy both soul and body in hell. There's a negative. And here's a positive. Are not two sparrows sold for a copper coin, and not one of them falls to the ground apart from your Father's will? But the very hairs of your head are all numbered. Do not fear, therefore, you are of more value than many sparrows. There's a positive. Then he has the positive and the negative. Therefore, whoever confesses me before men, him I will also confess before my Father who is in heaven. But whoever denies me before men, him I will also deny before my Father who is in heaven. I need to make certain that I'm not living my life to try to bring glory to myself. But I also need just as much to make certain I'm not trying to live my life where I want to be a Christian, but I just don't necessarily want everybody to know I'm a Christian. That I'm not going to speak out when I need to speak out. That I'll take my food and I'll just quietly bow my head and say my thanks and nobody will ever know. When you look back at Acts 27, look at how it concluded this little section. After Paul has spoken those words, he's taken bread and gave thanks to God. It said they were all encouraged and also took food themselves. I think it's the totality of his speech. It's not just that he says, eat this food because you need it. He showed a faith in God, and it was an encouragement to others. I believe that many times, if we can in our lives, and that doesn't mean that everything we say is going to be a prayer, it's going to be praise, it's going to be thanksgiving. It's okay to talk about the weather and sports and entertainment and other things sometimes. But words of faith and praise and thanksgiving, they might just be an encouragement to somebody. They can point them in the right direction. Let's use our words properly. Now I want you to turn to Colossians 3, and this one says a lot more about it. Give you the context. Colossians 3, first 2 chapters, he has said Jesus. Jesus is that head from which the body draws its strength. Everything we need is in Jesus. You don't have to look after the empty philosophies of men. Christ has it all. All the treasures are in Him. And in the 3rd chapter he begins, he said, you look upward. You focus on the Christ and on the hope that's in heaven with Christ. Let your life be hidden with Christ in God. And in fact, in verse 9, you've put off the old man with his deeds. You have, verse 10, put on the new man who is renewed in knowledge according to the image of Him who created him. Where there is neither Greek nor Jew, circumcised nor uncircumcised, barbarian, Scythian, slave nor free, but Christ is all and in all. The new man. The new man renewed in knowledge according to the image of Christ. It involves a lot of things he talks about in this 3rd and 4th chapter. But it's amazing how many things have to do with words. Look at verse 8. Now you yourselves are to put off all these: anger, wrath, malice, blasphemy, filthy language out of your mouth. Do not lie to one another. In verse 16, he said, let the word of Christ dwell in you richly in all wisdom, teaching and admonishing one another in psalms and hymns and spiritual songs, singing with grace in your hearts to the Lord. And whatever you do in word or deed, do all in the name of the Lord Jesus, giving thanks to God the Father through Him. He charges us to put away blasphemy. Those of you reading New American Standard, the English Standard, you have the word slander instead of blasphemy. And the difference arises, very simple explanation. The Greeks had, and they may have had some other words, but one particular Greek word, if it was used of God, in English it translates into blasphemy, speaking against God. If it's used against a person, we don't talk about blaspheming an ordinary person's name. We slander their name. We revile it. And so the translators have to decide, is this talking about against God? Is this against man? And decide. Well, in this particular case, because it's in a context of anger, wrath, and malice, I tend to think the English Standard, New American Standard, got it right when they went with slander. That the ugly, hate-filled speech that's become the norm in our society. Just the idea, just attacking people, putting people down, ridiculing people. That's become the norm. That's what people do. And you notice, again, as I said, it follows anger, wrath, malice. Malice is that ill will, that retaining of hatred toward others. You live your life in anger. You live your life with a wrath that's just constantly stewing inside of you. You live with ill will toward others. It eventually is going to spill out in your words. Jesus said in Matthew 12 that we read earlier, that our words reflect our hearts. You have a heart filled with those qualities, then it'll spill out into your words. We need to be careful of that. We need to guard against, he says in verse 8, filthy language, obscene talk, the English Standard says. There's just so much filthy language around us. It's part of our entertainment. Some genres of music just seem to be nothing but that. The movies and the standards are so low anymore. And when it's all around us, it's really easy for it to get into our hearts and sometimes creep into our speech. And then he warns us in verse 9, do not lie to one another. In other words, tell the truth. John 8:44, Jesus said of some, he said, they can't tell the truth because they're of their father the devil. There's no truth in him. He was a liar from the beginning. First time we're introduced to Satan, what's he do? He lies about God. He lies about the punishment of sin. Genesis 3, oh, you won't die. God's just trying to keep you from something good. The devil's a liar. Our job, what we're striving to do, as he will go on to say in verse 10, is we want to be renewed in knowledge according to the image of our Creator. I want to look and sound more and more like my Creator and less like the devil. Well, if I'm not honest, if people can't trust my word, who do I sound like? I don't sound like God. It says of God, it's impossible for God to lie. I need to be honest. And then look at verses 12 through 14. And I'm going to give you this. He doesn't specifically address words, and yet these qualities, if they're present, they will be reflected in the way we talk to people, in the way we talk about people. If they are absent, the very same thing will be true. If these things aren't present in our lives, in our hearts, it'll be reflected in the way we speak. Therefore, as the elect of God, holy and beloved, put on tender mercies, kindness, humility, meekness, long-suffering, bearing with one another, and forgiving one another. If anyone has a complaint against another, even as Christ forgave you, so you also must do. But above all these things, put on love, which is the bond of perfection. Does our speech, does it reflect kindness, humility, forbearance, forgiveness? Does it reflect love? He said these are the qualities the new man possesses. The person who is remade in the image of Christ. And let me tell you this, it's an ongoing process. This process of becoming like Christ, it is a work in progress. But more and more, my life ought to be filled with mercy and kindness and humility, a gentleness, a long-suffering, a forbearance, a forgiveness, a love. And if it is, you will see my language, my speech will more and more reflect that. I'm called on to be a different person. And look at verses 16 and 17. Read these earlier. Look at them again. Let the word of Christ dwell in you richly in all wisdom. There's a great start. You want to talk right? Let Christ's word fill your heart. Let it dwell richly in you. Teaching and admonishing one another in psalms and hymns and spiritual songs, singing with grace in your hearts to the Lord. And whatever you do in word or deed, do all in the name of the Lord Jesus, giving thanks to God the Father through Him. Going back to Acts 27, where Paul paused at the end of a 2-week storm, just before he's going to be shipwrecked, to give thanks to God. Is my life, and see, I'm afraid sometimes my life is filled with more complaining than it is thanksgiving. Giving thanks to God. Using my voice to give praise to Him in song. In James 5 and verse 13, he talks about, if we are sick, pray. If you're cheerful, sing psalms. In James 5, I don't think there's any kind of context of one another. Here is a context of one another. Singing, teaching, and admonishing one another. In my life, my words, Yes, they include kind words toward others. They include refraining from that vile, mean speech. They ought to include words of kindness and gentleness. But they also, on a regular basis, there ought to be heard coming from my lips words of thanksgiving and praise to God. To God be the glory, great things He has done, the song says. He truly has. He loved us so. Let's give more attention to this. And then lastly, I want to look at Proverbs 29. There's a lot in Proverbs 29, but I'm going to focus on a few verses that deal with our speech, our words. You put on the new man. You practice kindness and gentleness. But I want you to look at verse 1 of this chapter. He who is often rebuked and hardens his neck will suddenly be destroyed, and that without remedy. Kindness is not just important, it's absolutely necessary. And yet, sometimes rebuke is. Now, the point of this verse is don't be the guy who gets rebuked and stiffens the neck. The imagery of the cow, the bull, the oxen that would bow the neck when they tried to put the yoke upon it. But it's pointing to the fact that sometimes rebuke is needed. Back over a few pages, chapter 25, verse 11. A word fitly spoken is like apples of gold in settings of silver. Like an earring of gold and an ornament of fine gold is a wise rebuker to an obedient ear. Maybe we need to underscore that word wise. But rebuke is needed. I will tell you, no one ever loved more deeply than Jesus. No one ever cared more about people than Jesus. But did He ever rebuke His apostles? Did He scold Martha for being distracted? Did He sometimes, in some very strong language, rebuke those who were the enemies of His cause? Well, of course He did. The main thing that comes from my mouth, from your mouth, ought not to be words of rebuke. But if we have genuine concern for the souls of other people, sometimes we have to be a wise rebuker. We have to say things that need to be said. It needs to be that speech that's seasoned with salt. It needs to be done with the proper motive. Not from a, hey, I'm better than you and I'm going to tell you how I'm better than you. No, that's not wise rebuking. But folks need to be set back on the right path. Sometimes they've strayed and they need to be pointed back. We need to rebuke when necessary. And let's also say, verse 1, we need to make sure we don't harden our neck. We need, chapter 25, verse 12, to have the obedient ear when we are rebuked. But come back to chapter 29 and verse 5. I want to note another part of speech we need to be careful of. A man who flatters his neighbor spreads a net for his feet. Flattery is sometimes used in order to entrap, to take advantage of. Sincere compliments. Sometimes, let me just say this, sometimes a compliment that's a bit of a stretch is needed by someone. You know, that, your child is doing the best they can and, they draw something that, well, it looks like something I would have drawn, And so you kind of stretch it and say, good job. Because they need some encouragement. That's not the flattery he's talking about here. But when we flatter, Paul talks in 1 Thessalonians 2:5, he didn't come with words of flattery. Flattery is when we say things for our own purpose. You you go into the store, you're going to try on some suits. You try on that $200 suit, and the salesman says, that's not bad. Then he pulls down that $800 suit, and he persuades you to put it on. And he says, now, you look like you ought to be on the cover of GQ. Really? There is no suit that's going to make me worthy of the cover of GQ. They've never actually said that to me, but, you know the point. The guy is telling you how good you look in that suit because he wants commission off that suit. And the commission off an $800 suit is a lot more than the commission off a $200 suit. And we do this sometimes. We flatter to gain an advantage over people. Let's be encouraging. Let's be Paul. His letters are there are compliments sprinkled throughout them. Praise of people. And I think that's an area where we could all do better in. But not flattering to take advantage of people. But then come to verse 11. A fool vents all his feelings, but a wise man holds them back. We all know people about whom we say, well, you don't have to wonder what they're thinking. And sometimes we say it with a little bit of laughter, and then sometimes it's what we call a forced laughter. We've known times when they told us exactly what they thought, and we're like, ooh, there's a cringe, there's a hurt, there's a pain. It's just a simple fact. Not all feelings need to be expressed. Verse 20 says, do you see a man hasty in his words? There is more hope for a fool than for him. Some things don't need to be said. Other things, they may need to be said. But we don't need to be so hasty that we don't think about what we're saying, how we're saying it. Look at Colossians, the 4th chapter. Verse 2, continue earnestly in prayer, being vigilant in it with thanksgiving. Meanwhile, praying also for us that God would open to us a door for the word to speak the mystery of Christ, for which I am also in chains, that I may make it manifest as I ought to speak. Walk in wisdom toward those who are outside, redeeming the time. Let your speech always be with grace, seasoned with salt, that you may know how you ought to answer each one. Paul wanted to be able to say it the way it needed to be said. He said, you need to make sure that your speech is properly seasoned. There's an old expression that says silence is golden. And somebody has observed, and I think properly so, that silence is not always golden. Sometimes it's just plain yellow. And there is a time we need to speak up. We need to make sure that we're not being quiet because we're cowardly. But more times than not, when we do wrong, is it because we held back our feelings or because we vented our feelings? Because we were hasty in our speech. When I look at verse 1 and what it says about rebuke, I need to make sure that I qualify it by what he says about the wise man holding back his feelings. Don't just, in verse 20, don't be hasty. When rebuke is needed, take your time, make sure it's said properly. But when I read verse 20 and I read verse 11, that shouldn't prevent me from doing the rebuke. Both are needed. Thoughtful careful consideration of, does it need to be said? If it needs to be said, how should it be said? That's the aim of this chapter, that we give careful thought to what we're saying. There's a lot that could be said about this. This chapter of the lesson today, I just tried to let these 3 chapters speak and bring out some things that I needed and I hope you would need. Let's close by looking back to Matthew the 12th chapter and being reminded that our words do matter. But I say to you that for every idle word men may speak, they will give account of it in the day of judgment. For by your words you will be justified, and by your words you will be condemned. Let's be careful. We're going to sing a song. We sometimes call it an invitation song, a song for your encouragement. This verse speaks of judgment. Are you ready for judgment? Are you outside of Christ, needing to come to Him to be baptized and have your sins forgiven? Have you come to Christ, but you're not now living for Christ? We want you to be right with God. We want you to be prepared for that judgment. And if we can help in any way, we urge you to come as we stand and sing together. Thank you for watching this video. We're glad that you have found our channel, and in fact, while you're here, we would encourage you to subscribe to the Jones Road Church of Christ channel. We have several videos already up, and we believe you'll find these to be true to God's Word, helpful to you in your journey toward God. And if you have any questions, please reach out to us and let us know how we can help you.